Jeff Sebo is an associate professor of environmental studies at New York University. He is also the director of NYU's Center for Environmental and Animal Protection. His new book is called The Moral Circle: What Matters, Who Matters, What Matters, and Why. Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I wonder if we can start just by kind of defining what it means for an animal to have rights, and what does animal rights mean?
Yeah, well, that definitely depends on what kinds of rights you have in mind. We can talk about moral rights or legal rights or political rights. In ethics and morality, rights mean that you deserve protections that go beyond reducing your suffering and tending to your welfare. So, are there ways of treating you that are simply wrong, no matter what the consequences? Like, is killing you simply wrong or keeping you in captivity simply wrong? If so, then you can be said to have a right to life or a right to liberty. In the law and politics, it goes a little bit beyond that because then it also is a way of having legal and political standing. And that means that legal and political authorities have a responsibility to consider your legal and political claims for your own sake. So you might have a right to life or liberty under the law, or a right to have a court hear a claim if somebody feels you are being held in captivity unjustly. So often when we talk about animal rights, we are just talking about moral rights that animals have, ways of treating them that are simply wrong. But increasingly, people are also advocating for animals to be recognized as legal persons with legal rights and maybe even political rights that are appropriate for their interests and needs and vulnerabilities.
Yeah. So just as kind of a baseline, where are we at with animal rights? Do we have a broad consensus on a certain level in the United States of animal rights?
Yes and no. We have increasingly wide agreement that animals are sentient beings, deserving of consideration for their own sakes. And we do have many individuals who are committed to treating animals, at least companion animals like cats and dogs, but even to some extent other animals, including farmed animals and wild animals, treating those animals well. Obviously, opinions vary about what that means in practice. Some people think we need to end factory farming. Other people think we need to slightly improve conditions for animals in factory farming. There are not any robust systems of legal or political rights for animals in the United States right now. There have been legal cases where litigators have attempted to persuade judges to recognize a right to bodily liberty for individual chimpanzees or elephants. And some judges have taken those cases seriously. For example, in the state of New York, with recent cases involving Kiko and Tommy, two chimpanzees in 2018, I believe, and then Happy the Elephant in 2021. But so far, the people advancing claims involving animal personhood and rights have not won those cases. There have been a few friendly judges, but nothing that has actually prevailed yet. Now, in other countries, there has been a little bit more progress. Some cases that have been successful, but on the rights front, progress is slower than on the general welfare protections front.
Hmm. So, how does our relationship with animals kind of reflect our relationship with the environment and maybe also ourselves?
Yeah, great question and big question. There are all kinds of ways that we can take it with respect to how does it reflect our relationships with ourselves. An observation that philosophers and other people have made for many centuries now is that how we treat animals and in general how we treat the most vulnerable among us does say something about our beliefs and our values and how we behave with power and authority. And if we want to treat our fellow humans well, then we should treat non-human animals well too, because that can be a way of training ourselves to be kind to the vulnerable. And then if we train ourselves to be kind to the vulnerable, we might be more disposed to be kind to each other in moments of vulnerability. And I think there is something to those connections between human and non-human health and welfare. Now, there is also a broader conception of One Health and a broader policy framework of One Health. And this is basically a policy framework that recognizes the interconnections between human and animal and environmental health. And observes that if we want to really understand human health, then we also have to understand animal and environmental health too. And if we want to improve human health, then we have to improve animal and environmental health too as part of that process. And that has led to all sorts of really interesting and important research findings, for example, that many of our ways of interacting with animals, like in our food system, are not only bad for the individual farmed animals in that food system, but are also major drivers of global health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change. And then when we have global health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change, not surprisingly, they not only harm humans, but they also harm other animals, both directly and indirectly. Animals can get sick in a pandemic, animals can die in a climate change related fire or flood, or because of human culling or abandonment during those sorts of crises. So, in all of these ways, people are increasingly recognizing that our fates are linked in a world reshaped by human activity. And we really ought to be considering human and animal and environmental health considerations holistically.
So just building off that, the notion of improving our relationship with animals, uh, you described kind of how that also helps us pursue sustainability. Are there examples? You mentioned the kind of a policy framework, the One Health.
Mhm.
Uh, is it the One Health policy framework?
hmm
Uh,
Yeah, the One Health policy framework, which is a component of other quite influential policy frameworks at the global level, the international level, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which basically lay out a set of goals and targets and indicators that countries can endorse and pursue in order to be able to develop their economies in a way that is more environmentally resilient and sustainable. And if we fully incorporate One Health into the UN Sustainable Development Goals as the UN itself endorses, then we would have opportunities to, through food and energy and transportation system reform and basic infrastructure, we would be able to improve human and animal well-being at the same time. So one example, as you suggested, is food, and that would be a matter of building a better food system that was more humane, healthful, sustainable, centering plant-based foods, more animal-based foods, less, both for animal welfare, but then also for public health and the environment. Another great example, as I noted a moment ago, is infrastructure. We have to be changing our global infrastructure anyway in order for cities and other human areas to be more resilient and sustainable in the face of human-caused climate change. As we do that, we have all kinds of low-hanging fruit opportunities to also make them safer for urban animals, other non-humans who come through. Like we can change buildings to have bird safe glass, and we can change transportation systems to have wildlife corridors. We can add more urban green spaces with habitat connectivity. Those are all ways of being better for humans and animals and the environment at the same time. So if we think about these policy issues with the One Health lens, then that can just be an invitation to include animals in that conversation and create policies that are better for a wider range of stakeholders.
yeah. So how do we just going off that for a second, how do we build the case for those policies? And I'll get to kind of the
Mhm.
questions about the morals and ethics and stuff, but the notion that not everybody's on the same page. How do we build the case for some of this infrastructure that would support animals, like
Mhm.
in what you described in cities and just thinking about how animals move and live and how we can support them and like why would someone who's not an animal rights advocate get behind this?
Yeah, I definitely agree that we have major political will issues with respect to animal welfare and animal rights, especially for interventions that are costly or in some way would impose sacrifices on human communities. And so I think to answer your question, a good way forward, at least initially, is to focus on low cost, low hanging fruit opportunities to secure co-benefits for humans and other animals in the environment. Of course, everybody is a little bit altruistic and a little bit self-interested. We all do want animals to have better lives, all else being equal, but we want us and other humans to have better lives too, perhaps first and foremost. So if we can focus early efforts on the kinds of interventions that would not cost all that much money, would not be all that disruptive, are part of infrastructure changes that we need to be making anyway for humans and the environment. And then we can add an element that would be better for animals too, while being equally good, if not better for us, then that can just be win, win, win. And it makes it easier for everybody to accept it, even if they accept it for different reasons. And this is why I think that infrastructure changes like bird safe glass, like wildlife corridors, like urban green spaces with habitat connectivity are really good places to start because they are better for many animals and they help us build institutions that can consider animals and they help us normalize the idea of considering animals. But they are also really easy for a lot of different people to endorse because it benefits us too to have fewer building collisions with birds or vehicle collisions with mammals crossing the street and to have more beautiful green spaces and breathable air in cities. So I think that can be a good way of getting your foot in the door. And then as you make progress, you do have those institutions and you do normalize the idea of caring for wild animals. And then at that point, people might be able to wrap their heads around slightly costlier interventions or interventions that involve at least minor trade-offs for humans.
So that makes a ton of sense to me, like starting with the low hanging fruit and the low cost and the things that create kind of those co-beneficial scenarios. Uh,
Hmm.
but can you talk about the process of kind of building, maybe not building consensus, but like
Hmm.
advocating for animal rights and animal welfare and speaking to the morals and ethics of it? And maybe have there been any cases either recently or in history where we've seen major gains to animal rights and welfare by changes in thinking on morals and ethics?
Hmm. Yeah. So when you think about theories of change, how do we create a better world for animals? My general view is that we need a kind of broad, pluralistic coalition with a lot of different people engaging in a lot of different activities. And so no particular kind of activity is enough. As much as I would love to think that a really good philosophy book or a really compelling philosophy teacher could be enough to solve the problem, I think that is not the case. But the same is true for any other intervention, including certain types of activism and advocacy or legal and political reform. I think we need people to be working on all of those different projects at the same time, and then they can be mutually reinforcing. They can all help each other be a little bit more effective. And I do think that academic books, academic classes, academic public engagement can be one part of that broader effort. Again, it can only do so much by itself, but I have seen, for example, the arguments of Peter Singer, who wrote Animal Liberation in the 1970s, or of Tom Regan, who wrote The Case for Animal Rights in the 1980s, or Carol Adams, who wrote The Sexual Politics of Meat in the 1990s. I have seen that really change hearts and minds, including of people who are in positions to change policies, and that is happening today too. So a few years ago, my colleague at the London School of Economics, Jonathan Birch, he and a team wrote a policy report about why the UK government should extend its Animal Welfare Act to include a wider range of species. It previously included only vertebrates. And Birch and his colleagues argued, well, there is increasing evidence of sentience in invertebrates too, like cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters. So, hey, you, the UK government, you should include these animals in your animal welfare acts too. And to their credit, the UK government did as a result of this report written by a philosopher and his team. So I think you can see evidence, including in this issue, animal welfare and rights, of philosophical arguments making a difference in some cases for some stakeholders. And so I just want us to be doing what we can to keep making those forms of progress while other people are doing that other needed kind of work like activism and advocacy and legal and political reforms and so on.
So you mentioned the case in the UK where
Hmm.
There was kind of an expansion of animals that would be included under an umbrella of animal rights. Is the argument that effectively expand that kind of umbrella that there are more animals that we know now to be sentient, or
Hmm.
is that the only thing that's really driving um, the kind of the growth and number of protected or not protected, but like
Yeah.
considered animals in those conversations?
Yeah, really good question. First of all, I would say that this was an expansion in terms of the coverage of welfare protections, but not in terms of the extension of rights. I do still think we are a little bit farther away from having any kind of recognizable system of rights for animals in both the US and the UK and elsewhere. But still, as we work for rights, welfare protections are good. To answer your question directly, yes, I think sentience and consciousness tend to be the main features that policymakers look for when deciding whether to include animals in welfare protection laws for their own sakes. And what I mean by those terms is consciousness is the ability to have subjective experiences like feelings and emotions. If it feels like something to be you, then you count as conscious. And then sentience is when you can consciously have positive and negative feelings like pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering and satisfaction and frustration. And for a lot of philosophers and a lot of other people, consciousness and sentience really are the key to having a kind of intrinsic moral status or standing or significance. Because when you have consciousness and sentience, when it feels like something to be you, and you can consciously experience pleasure, pain, happiness, and suffering, satisfaction, frustration, then you really have a stake in what happens to you, what matters to you, what happens to you. And so we really have a responsibility to consider your interests and your welfare needs when making decisions that affect you. But they are not the only features of animal minds and lives that matter, because animals also have agency. They can set and pursue goals in a self-directed manner and engage in problem solving and flexible decision making. And many animals have sociality and relationality and cultures, and they can have relationships with each other and with us, and that can be emotionally significant to them. And so, even if sentience and consciousness are kind of the price of admission for welfare laws, you also have to consider these broader aspects of being an animal. Like, what is your agency like, and what kind of needs does that come along with, and what is your sociality and culture like, and what kinds of needs does that come along with? And you have to consider all of that in order to figure out what the animal needs and what it takes for you to treat them well.
So, do we as a society have a comprehensive understanding of how many animals are sentient and conscious? And then the next group you mentioned that have more of those, I don't know if you call them criteria or the additional characteristics. Do we have
Mhm.
like a clear idea of the number and scale of the animals that we'd be talking about if we were to try to do something in a comprehensive way?
We are pretty far away from having a clear idea about exactly which animals are conscious and sentient, but we are working hard to reduce our current state of unclarity. And in particular, there have been some significant developments in the science and philosophy and policy of animal consciousness over the past decade or so. One is that we have shifted from asking yes and no questions to asking how likely is consciousness questions. So instead of asking like, is this animal conscious or not, we are looking at evidence, and on the basis of the available evidence, making at least rough estimates about whether this animal is more likely or less likely to be conscious. And then in the policy space, we are not any longer waiting for proof that an animal is conscious before extending them basic welfare protections. Instead, we are treating this as a case of risk, high stakes decision making involving uncertainty. And that means that the standard, the threshold should be whether there is a realistic possibility that an animal is conscious or sentient, given the evidence available. And so when you put those together, not looking for all or nothing, yes, no answers, but rather looking for different degrees of confidence, higher and lower degrees of confidence based on the evidence, and then being willing to extend at least minimal protections to animals when there is at least a realistic possibility of consciousness given the evidence. When you put those together, it ends up allowing for the extension of at least minimal welfare protections to a much larger number and wider range of animals than we previously have contemplated. And so in particular, in spring 2024, Kristen Andrews from York University and Jonathan Birch, again from the London School of Economics, and I organized and hosted the launch for the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness at New York University, where I teach. And this declaration, which was signed by hundreds of scientists all over the world, it holds that the evidence now supports not only attributions of consciousness to mammals and birds, but also at least a realistic possibility of consciousness in all vertebrates. That includes mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, and many invertebrates, including at minimum cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters, and even insects like ants and bees and flies. And the declaration also held that when there is at least a realistic possibility of consciousness in an animal, we have a responsibility to consider and mitigate welfare risks for that animal when making decisions that affect them. And that is where the emerging science of animal consciousness is now. There is increasingly wide agreement that there is at least a realistic possibility of consciousness in those species that I mentioned a moment ago, and that at least minimal welfare protections for those species are warranted now. And then we have a commitment to try to learn more so we can further reduce our uncertainty from here.
Yeah. I'm curious, how does this work overlap or relate to or collaborate with work on protecting endangered species? Is it is it the case that um, endangered species are helping advance animal rights because of their rarity, or
Mhm.
how do you think about that and what's going on there?
Yeah, really great question. I think a lot of people assume that protecting species can be a proxy for protecting individual animals. And of course, that can be true to an extent. There are interactions between environmental protection and animal protection, and between the conservation of species and the protection of individuals, because we depend on environments and we depend on our species. But as we know from humanity, merely making sure that the species can survive to see another generation is not by itself enough to ensure that the individual members of that species can have good lives and like food to eat and water to drink, right? We can make sure that humanity survives to see another generation, even though many individual humans are suffering and dying unnecessarily and avoidably, right? And so we can bring that same observation to animals and their species. It is important to protect animal species and to protect ecosystems and environments, but that is not by itself enough to ensure that individual non-human animals are having good lives. We can protect species while still allowing all sorts of individual animals to suffer and die unnecessarily in avoidable ways, and as a result of human activity, due to hunger and thirst and illness, injury, being caught in climate change related fires and floods. And so by bringing animal welfare into the conversation, we can continue to pursue environmental protection and the conservation of species, but now we can make the promotion of individual well-being, to the extent realistically possible, one factor among many in those equations. And that way we can make policies that are better both at the species level and at the individual level.
Yeah. I have maybe a silly question. Do you think there's a correlation between the animals that we feature in like children's books and movies and shows, and
Hmm.
the animals that we're willing to like think about the welfare of and advocate for, maybe at a higher level of society, not just policymakers?
Yeah, it's not a silly question at all. I think that question is really interesting and important and neglected in the space. Yes, I do think there's a correlation between the animals who appear in TV shows and movies, especially for children, and in advocacy campaigns and policy documents. And some of that is because of a common cause, namely, humans are wired to be more empathetic, sympathetic with quote unquote charismatic megafauna. So animals who look like us, who act like us, who have large heads, large bodies, large eyes, are very expressive. They have fur instead of scales. They have symmetrical features instead of asymmetrical features. They have four limbs instead of six or eight limbs. We tend, as a matter of fact, to naturally empathize, sympathize more with animals like that. We also tend to sympathize more with animals whom we use for companionship as opposed to animals whom we use for food or research or other commodifying purposes. And so all of that gets wrapped up into A, which animals we choose to place at the center of TV shows or movies, and then B, which animals we choose to place at the center of advocacy campaigns or policy documents. But then also I think there is a direct interaction between this,
Hmm.
that when we feature animals in media, that by itself warms people up to the idea of protecting those animals. And then vice versa, when people are motivated to protect those animals, they might be more motivated to depict them in TV shows and movies. And actually, we at the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program hosted an event with some authors of children's books about animals, Elliot Schrafer and Peter Brown, who have written extensively about the lives of animals for young people, because we wanted to ask them, like, why do you do what you do, and how do you see your work affecting how children see animals? And I would love to have more conversations like that. I think it really is important to think about how we educate people and entertain people and how that changes values in society.
Yeah, I wonder if it would be an effective strategy to start uh, if there was some way that you could coordinate the introduction of more and more animals into children's
Hmm.
books over time, or have some sort of strategic effort. You mentioned the companionship of different animals.
Hmm.
Is there uh, an effort or any thinking on uh, what the what it might look like to domesticate more animals, and if that would
Mm.
help advance animal welfare, or is that maybe the wrong way of thinking about it, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, really, really interesting question. By the way, I do like the idea of creating more fiction about animals and about animal protection. I think that could be valuable. The trick, of course, is it has to be good as fiction. And when you make fiction because you are an advocate first and foremost, then it tends to not be good fiction. It tends to not be a good story with complicated characters and good drama and good comedy. It tends to be kind of preachy and off-putting. So the trick is to actually put the story first and the characters first and the conflict and color first, and then if it happens to also invite people into this other world where animals are treated better, then that can come along for the ride. So I want to note for anyone contemplating this form of change making, that you gotta really focus first and foremost on the story. In any case, to answer your really interesting and kind of provocative question, should we save animals by domesticating them and keeping them in captivity? That, you will not be surprised to hear, is an active, ongoing debate within animal protection circles, because there are some people who think life in the wild is worse than life in captivity. Yes, in captivity, we control animals, we dominate them, we prevent them from expressing certain natural instincts. But in the wild, life is, as Hobbes would say, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, full of preventable suffering as a result of hunger, thirst, illness, injury, predation, parasitism. Right now, we are in a situation where neither situation is particularly good for most animals, especially most naturally wild animals. Captivity is rough, especially in most zoos and aquariums that are really optimized for the human experience. And the wilderness is rough, because there really are a lot of natural dangers and a lot of human caused dangers. And so I think we are not really able to say yet what it takes to, at scale, in a way that can be achievable and sustainable, create a better world for currently wild animals. What we can say is that we do not yet have the paradigm. It is not going to be an expansion of zoos and aquariums built for human observers of animals. It is not going to be preservation of natural spaces increasingly affected by human caused climate change and spread of diseases and loss of biodiversity. So it will have to be something else, maybe more sanctuaries where the animals are put front and center instead of the human observers, maybe more managed reserves where the animals are able to live naturalistic lives, but there are human caretakers who are preventing major disasters and helping them meet basic needs. It could be something like that, but I think it is probably too early to say.
Well, so in those two examples that you mentioned, sanctuaries and managed reserves I mean, there are examples of that now, right? Where
Hmm.
different parts of the world they have much larger than zoo areas, and the animals are
Hmm.
able to um, uh, live as they would. But
Hmm.
is that addressing the concerns about animal rights and animal welfare, or is it just making a more concerted effort to um, protect the places where animals live, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think if the question is what kinds of specifically non-human animal spaces to build, sanctuaries and managed reserves are the most productive place to look. But there is disagreement about whether they, at least as they currently exist, would promote animal welfare, respect animal rights. Some people think we need to meet a much higher standard to promote animal welfare. We need animals to have more consistent access to food and water, medical, veterinary attention, and that would require more human intervention in these somewhat naturalistic spaces. Other people think, no, that is the opposite of what we need. That would be a kind of imperialist enterprise. And what we really need in order to treat animals well and respect their rights is to leave them alone to the extent possible in a world already shaped by human activity. So there are debates there. For me, I think we can have those debates and we should have those debates, but we can also recognize which institutions are robustly better than other institutions according to all perspectives. And this is the spirit in which I say, hey, sanctuaries are robustly better than zoos and aquariums from an animal welfare and an animal rights perspective. And in my view, managed nature reserves are robustly better than imposing climate change on animals and then leaving them to deal with it all by themselves on that side. And then, of course, there is a prospect not only of building specifically non-human animal spaces like sanctuaries and nature reserves, but also, as I was saying before, taking shared multi-species spaces and making them more accommodating not only for humans but for other animals. And this is where I think urban infrastructure and transportation infrastructure and these other forms of shared infrastructure are so important because animals do live here too, and many animals will flee the cities. They will be climate refugees under
Hmm.
climate change. And so not only creating spaces specifically for animals, but also taking the spaces that we share with them, whether we like it or not, and making them more hospitable for animals, I think that will also be a really important part of the equation.
Yeah, I'm curious. What is there? Is there an argument for zoos and aquariums from animal rights and animal welfare activists, or is it generally that those are uh, they there isn't a good version of that right now, where they're
Yeah.
operating in these much smaller spaces and not in their natural environment, and
Hmm. Hmm.
um, isolated, and all these different things.
Yeah. From a certain kind of animal rights perspective, zoos and aquariums are out of the question because they take wild animals from their natural habitats and families and they put them in a human dominated space and strip them of their freedom and autonomy. From animal welfare perspective, it depends a little bit more on the costs and benefits for the individual animals of the particular institutions, as well as what the alternatives realistically would be. So a general argument for zoos and aquariums is that they can protect individual animals whose lives in the wild would be worse. And they can also promote research and education and conservation enterprises that can indirectly be beneficial for animals. The response to that argument is that, okay, that might be the stated aspiration, but when the institution is set up so that it makes money by getting tickets from human onlookers, it ends up prioritizing their experience over the well-being of the animals, and so the animals end up suffering much more than they really ought to in
Mm.
captivity. Not in every zoo and aquarium, and for every animal, but for the vast majority of zoos and aquariums and the vast majority of animals in them. And it is not clear that they are living up to their aspirations towards research and education and conservation either, because what they are studying and teaching is not really what we need to know. What we need to know is how the animals can live good lives. But what we are learning and teaching is what their lives are like in these human dominated spaces, and that we have a right to dominate them in these ways. And those might be the not only wrong lessons to be learning, but actively counterproductive lessons to be learning. And with conservation, some amount of money might be going to conservation efforts, but if our goal was to support conservation efforts, there are probably more efficient ways of doing that. And by the way, I should say my colleague Dale Jameson wrote a very influential article, I believe in the 1970s, called "Against Zoos," that makes many of these points, and a lot of people still look back to that article to today to understand this issue.
So, just thinking about kind of people that are discovering or navigating towards um, animal protection, animal welfare, animal rights, and um, they're getting more interested. What advice would you give to people to kind of pursue maybe a career path or maybe just their interest in this work?
Well, I would say welcome. The more the merrier. We need all of the bodies we can get in order to make a better world for animals. And I would also say what I said before. I really do believe that we really benefit from having a broad pluralistic coalition, and that means different people from different countries and different walks of life working to help animals in different ways. And so people who are researchers and educators, we can be writing books and papers and teaching classes and giving talks about these issues. But then other people who work in law and politics can be improving the legal and political situation. People who work for businesses can be working to transform their practices in a way that is better for animals. We can all be asking, hey, can I move plants away from my office building's windows and put a certain kind of tape on the windows to reduce bird strikes? So there are all kinds of ways of making a difference. And so I think a good question to ask is just, who am I? And what are my talents and interests, and what is my background, and what are my connections, and then how can I creatively, opportunistically, but also strategically and pragmatically make use of that in order to move the needle slightly for animals. The other point that I would note here is that it is a long grind, and there is not going to be obvious transformative change overnight. And so it is good to be ambitious and aspirational and set kind of transformative long-term goals for this entire movement, but also good to be strategic, pragmatic, incrementalist, take it one step at a time as an individual actor so you can take on the issue in a way that can be emotionally and physically sustainable for you.
Yeah, well, just pulling on that thread a little bit, what do you think the future looks like? You mentioned like that long grind. What
Mhm.
does the long term look like for animal rights and animal welfare? Or maybe what are some potential futures as we're
Mhm.
thinking about long term sustainability?
Yeah. Well, I think it helps to think about positive futures that we can pursue in addition to negative futures that we should try to avoid. And so when I think about positive futures that we should pursue, I think of, first of all, a world where animals are recognized as having an appropriate kind of basic legal and political status or standing. So they may or may not have the exact same kind of legal personhood and political citizenship as ordinary adult humans do, but they can at least have a form of legal and political status that are appropriate given their interests and needs and vulnerabilities, where a judge will hear their claims and where their rights will be respected, and then downstream of that, I imagine a transformed food system where we are feeding everyone really good, tasty, healthy, culturally significant food made out of plants and fungi, maybe plant-based meat or cultivated meat, but not animal products coming from factory farms, industrial animal agriculture. I picture cities and other human spaces that are transformed, that are much more hospitable for non-human animals, that are reimagined as multi-species communities, and where the people who govern them are really understanding themselves as governing a city that is accountable to all of its stakeholders, including humans and urban animals who happen to reside there too. And I think that is actually achievable. I just think it will take decades and decades and decades of difficult work to get there. But it really is a possibility. And if we make the right choices now, we can start building momentum gradually in that direction.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time and sharing your insights and your wisdom. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road. Thank you so much for speaking today. And yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Joe. It was a great conversation.